Alright, let's finish up chapter 15. In the last lecture, if you remember, we talked specifically about how Darwin created this theory, the evidence that he collected along his voyage on the Beagle, and ultimately how that evidence kind of weighed in his mind and how he interpreted that data. But now, once all of this evidence is collected, he then kind of went on to further the theory and present his case and talk about all the evidence and how it specifically applies to evolution. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Darwin compared this idea of artificial selection to natural selection. And remember from last time I talked about the breeds of dogs and how humans have created all the breeds of dogs by artificially selecting. And by artificial, remember, I'm talking about the man-created selection. It's not that it's fake selection, it's just humans have selected for the traits that they feel are most fit or most desirable, and that may or may not be the traits that nature would have selected to be the most fit or the most desirable. So Darwin said that if humans can create dog breeds, then nature should be able to create different breeds or different species. That selecting of traits that is done randomly by nature, remember, is natural selection. The selecting of traits by humans is artificial selection, and dogs aren't the only thing that are artificially selected. If you remember from last lecture, I talked about Brussels sprouts and broccoli and cauliflower and kohlrabi, and all of those things are selected by humans, or were selected by humans, and were created by basically enlarging different parts of the mustard plant. Competitive for resources by species was caused by high birth rates. Remember, high birth rates means that species produce a lot of offspring, and all of those offspring are not going to be able to live long enough to reproduce themselves. But if you create high birth rates, naturally those that are stronger are going to rise to the top and are going to reproduce more, and those that are weaker are probably going to die in the struggle for existence before they're able to reproduce. And if those that don't reproduce can't reproduce, they're not going to pass on their offspring or pass on their traits to their offspring, and so their genes that make them less fit are going to die out with them. Conversely, those that are most fit are going to reproduce more, and so they're going to pass on their traits more to their offspring, and the species as a whole is going to kind of shift in that direction. All species had to struggle for their existence, and they still do. Humans struggle for existence. We've just created a little more technology and a little more sophistication to our struggle for existence, but we still do. Faster predators kill slower prey. The faster prey would reproduce, and the next generation would have the potential to be faster. So if you looked at mice and cats, cats are pretty quick, mice are pretty quick. Those mice that are faster in terms of other mice are going to stay clear of predators longer and are going to reproduce more, and naturally the population of mice are going to get faster as a result of all the slower mice being eaten and not being able to reproduce, or not being allowed to reproduce. On the same side, as prey items get faster, the slower predators die off because they no longer can catch prey, and so they have to get faster as well. And so you kind of have this cat and mouse game, no pun intended, in this struggle for existence. The prey items and the predator items have to get faster, or have to get smarter, or have to get more elusive, or have to get more creative, or whatever, in order to win this battle for survival. Okay. The key factor to existence was a species' fitness, right? And I've talked about it over and over and over. Fitness means not how strong you are, or not how physically fit you are, like we usually think about it, but a species' fitness is how well they survive in their given environment. And a species that is very fit in a particular environment will be less fit in a different environment because they have adapted and evolved to be fit in a particular environment. Descent with modification is another big idea. Remember, as species descend through the years, they are going to modify themselves. And remember, evolution doesn't occur to individuals, it happens to populations, and it takes a lot of time. Species evolve, individuals adapt. So you as an individual, human, can adapt to live in your environment and can adapt to become more fit for your environment, but you're not going to evolve in the evolution sense. You are just a small part of the evolution of the human race, and and you play a vital role in the evolution of that human race. So let's talk a little bit more about the evidence. One of the biggest pieces of evidence, and if you remember from a lot of the videos we've watched, the fossil record is a huge piece of evidence. Why is the fossil record so important? Because fossils are legitimate remains of living organisms, and fossils are basically proof that certain organisms were on the earth and they are no longer on the earth. And so you have to think two things. Either those organisms have changed to become organisms that are actually alive today, or they died off and became extinct, which a lot of the organisms around the time of the dinosaurs did. The fossil record is also a record of history of life. Okay, we can look through the layers of the earth like pages in a book, and we can say this organism was clearly alive now, and it is clearly not alive now. Okay, and now speaking in relative terms there, but the fossil record is a vital, very important part of the evolution as we know it, because it serves not only as a history of life, but it actually gives us a record of the living things that were alive at that time. The lower the rock layer, the older the fossils. Earth must be many, many, many million years old rather than thousands. And remember back when we talked about the scientists like Lyell and Hutton, they thought that the Earth was just a few thousand years old because they really didn't have a scale of how long the Earth has been here. And so they thought that it was pretty recent, because at that time a few thousand years seemed to be an eternity. Now we know that a few thousand years is really not that long at all. And the Earth is much older than we previously thought. Countless species must have lived for a time, then died, and the dinosaurs are perfect examples of that. Documenting these fossils shows how life could have changed over time. If you look at the fossils over the course of a few million years, you might notice that the fossils change over time. That is basically proof that evolution has happened, or at least a big piece of evidence that would suggest that evolution has happened. And one of the biggest pitfalls of the evidence of the evolution in terms of fossil record is the gaps that remain in the fossil record are holes in the theory of evolution. Okay, we can't fill in those gaps with what we speculate happened because science is very much important when we talk about like evidence. Actual evidence is important when we're talking about fossil record. Gaps do not necessarily mean that the theory of evolution is incorrect. We just need to further our understanding of the species and fossil record, and so that we need to strengthen it. So if we talk about straddle layers and why the deeper layers are older, it makes very much sense when we look at a diagram like this. Now, most bodies of water, in fact all bodies of water, typically have some kind of running water or stream or river that flows into them. And those moving bodies of water like a lake or river, stream, creek, that kind of thing, are going to pick up sediment, and it's going to deposit sediment onto the top of our lake bottom, if you will. As these layers continually get buried and buried and buried and buried and buried with more sediment and more organisms that have died and fallen out of the water, they get buried deeper and deeper and deeper, and so that when a new stream comes through, like if this solidified and turned into rock, and these fossils then solidified in the rock, and a stream comes through and erodes this kind of canyon, it exposes these layers, and we can look at the organisms that lived in these layers, and we can determine a relative age by radioactive dating, carbon-14 dating, and we can also say that this organism is older than this organism just because of the position in the rocks. Okay, so this one's older because it was buried first. This one is younger because it was buried second. Let's talk a little bit about geographical distribution. Similar species have a common ancestor. We've talked about it a lot, right? Like on the Galapagos, the finches, the main land had a common ground finch. That common ground finch flew to the Galapagos Islands and basically diversified into the 14 or so species we see today. It is possible, though, for dissimilar species to have similar structures, and we're going to talk about that. What does that mean? Similar structures could be wings, and you know by this time on Earth, or by this time in your life, that birds have wings, but not all bird wings can fly. Ostriches have wings, penguins have wings, finches, eagles have wings, and not all of them use them in the same way. Similarly, not only birds aren't the only thing that have wings. Insects have wings. Okay, so those are similar structures, but they are in dissimilar species. Does that mean that a bee that has wings and a bird that has wings are closely related? Not necessarily. They can create these structures separately if they make those species more fit in their environment. This occurs because similar structures evolved under similar pressures from similar environments. So if a meadowlark and a honeybee live on the plains of Kansas and would benefit from the development of wings, they're going to develop wings because it would make both species more fit. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have a common ancestor. Because of similar natural selection pressures, some species that are clearly not related could have similar structures. Again, a honeybee and a bat, for instance, or a honeybee and an eagle. Both have wings, but they only produced wings or only evolved to have wings because of similar natural selection pressures, not necessarily because they are clearly related. We call these structures homologous body structures, and by definition, homologous body structures means that they have different mature forms but originate from the same embryonic tissues, like homologous chromosomes being from the maternal and paternal father or mother. We get a set of chromosomes, one chromosome number 1 from mom, one chromosome number 1 from dad. Those are homologous chromosomes because they contain the same genes. The genes might not necessarily be the same thing, but they are homologous nonetheless. And so these are structures that are homologous. And when we talk about homologous structures, we're talking about structures that have the different mature forms, so they can be different, but they originate from the same embryonic tissues. The legs of a turtle are homologous to the legs of a horse, which are homologous to the legs of an alligator, which are homologous to the wings of a bird. They are used for different things and evolved in different ways, yet they arrive from the same types of cells embryologically. And we'll talk about embryology, which is the study of embryos. Embryos are vital in our understanding of evolution because we can look at the way organisms evolve, or I should say, look at the way embryos develop. And it doesn't matter if you're a frog, a chicken, a human, a turtle. Most of the time, our embryos look identical until 2 to 3 weeks after conception. Okay. Not all homologous structures serve useful purposes. Those that are reduced to traces, we call those vestiges. Okay, and we call them vestigial organs or vestigial structures. Are those things that are not needed, like our appendix. Okay, I'm sure some of you watching this video have had your appendix taken out. It is a vestigial organ. We don't need it. We can live perfectly fine without it. Wisdom teeth are vestigial organs. Okay, or I shouldn't say organs. They're vestigial structures. They were once needed in a skull of our ancestors, but because our skull has changed shape over time, we no longer need that last molar, and in most cases it causes pain because we just don't physically have enough room to support extra molars. And so often we get them removed and we live perfectly fine without them. Legs of skinks are not used to walk, yet their appearance does not hinder their survival. They are just vestigial. Okay. Wings of ostriches are vestigial. They don't use them to fly, but they don't hinder their ability to live, and so they don't get rid of them. Appendix in humans is another example. Here is a diagram that shows you homologous structures. Notice that there is a same pattern. There's a 1 bone, 2 bones, little bones, digits. 1 bone, 2 bone, little bone, digits. 1 bone, 2 bone, little bone, digits. 1 bone, 2 bone, little bones, digits. So you can see, and they are color-coded, that in every single tetrapod or every single animal on Earth follows this same bone structure, and that's a big piece of evidence for evolution and this idea of natural selection because it basically proves that there is a common ancestor among all living things, and this was the common bone structure found in that ancestor, and so most living things have that same bone structure still. Sure, the digits have been elongated in a bat or a whale. They've been bent in different ways in a cat or a dog that walks differently than humans, but you could say that they have a common ancestor, or that at least looks like they have a common ancestor because of this homologous structure. Analogous structure is, like I was talking about before, when we have same structures but differently, or what I should say is they're used in the same way, but they're different structurally. This one has bones and a skin membrane. This one has an exoskeleton and is basically just chitin, which is a complex carbohydrate, kind of like cellulose. Vestigial structures, remember, is like an appendix in humans. It's also like a wing on an ostrich. They do not use them to fly. This bird cannot fly, nor will it ever try to, but it hasn't lost its wings because it doesn't hinder its ability to survive. Evidence of evolution in embryology. If we look at the similarities that exist in embryology, we see similar patterns when we look at embryos. Okay, similar tissues come from these similar developmental patterns, and these similar tissues produce homologous structures. There are different tissues that arise from different structures within the human embryo or within any embryo. We've got the endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm. All of these different germ layers are going to basically produce the organs within us, the skeletal muscular component to us, and then the central nervous system component to us. If we look at embryos, this is a chick embryo or chicken embryo. This is a human embryo. Notice that a human has a tail. It is not until the later stages of fetal development that the tail is actually reduced to a tailbone. But why would a human embryo have a tail much like a lizard or a chicken if we don't have a tail in human adult form or even baby form? And the answer, at least that is suggested by a lot of scientists, is that our ancestors had a tail, and so our embryo still shows a tail developing, but we then lose it because a tail maybe has impacted us in a negative way, and so it's been reduced over the years, and so we've evolved away from a tail. So if we summarize what Darwin's theory is all about, individuals differ and some variation is heritable. Remember, we are going to pass on our variation to our offspring, but we don't pass on all variation to our offspring. It's only the variation that makes us as a species more fit in our environment. Organisms produce more individuals than can survive. Many of those that do survive do not reproduce. We call that survival of the fittest. Remember, natural selection places pressure on organisms. That pressure is going to cause organisms to die and cause organisms to rise to the top. Those that rise to the top are going to produce more offspring and thus pass organism or offspring their traits, which make the species as a whole more fit. Organisms compete for natural resources. We call that natural selection. And each organism has advantages and disadvantages that lead to its fitness. Those can reproduce, will, and pass those traits to the next generation. Species alive today have descended with modification from an ancestral species of the past. And so if we, again, kind of put this all into one sentence, organisms produce a lot of offspring. Those offspring that are most fit will reproduce the most. Those offspring that are less fit will die and probably not reproduce at all. Organisms that are most fit will cause the species as a whole, due to them producing offspring, to change over time. We call that descent with modification, and evolution is basically driven by this descent with modification and natural selection. Strengths and weaknesses of the evolutionary theory. One of the weaknesses, it is uncertain as to how life began. There is nothing in evolution yet that has talked about how life has begun or that has tried to disprove this whole idea of creation. How do new species arise? We do know how new species arise, or at least one of the strengths of evolutionary theory is that we can use evidence to propose how new species arise. But we don't know how new species arise, really, at least in the early days. Why species became extinct. Theory offers insight to biological and biomedical sciences all the way to ecology. Why is this idea so revolutionary and so important to the field of biology? It's because every single field of biology and biomedical sciences, biomedical engineering, and ecology, every single field of biology is intertwined in this idea of evolution, because everything that is alive changes over time, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about microbiology like viruses and bacteria, or you're talking about wildlife ecology. Everything plays into this evolutionary idea, and it's really important. And so one of the last things, or the last thing we're going to talk about, is this histogram, or this phylogenetic tree, I should say. And these branching points are basically the common ancestor between the two branches. So there was a species here, and these are the branches that kind of diverged off of it. Okay, and so this is a common ancestor between ostriches and hawks. This is a common ancestor between mammals and everything else, that is lizards, snakes, crocodiles, ostriches, and other birds. Okay, this is a more ancient common ancestor. This is a more recent common ancestor. Notice that the more recent common ancestor is going to be obviously bird, because it gave rise to the ostriches and basically other birds. This is a common ancestor that gave rise to crocodiles and the birds. Birds are very closely related to reptiles and dinosaurs. Crocodiles are probably the most related to dinosaurs in terms of other reptiles. But you'll see that there are spots along the way that are specific characteristics. So digit-bearing limbs are going to be when that evolved. So digit-bearing limbs were evolved here, and so notice everything after that point in history has digit-bearing arms, unless of course you're talking about snakes, which used to have legs but have lost those because they don't need them to survive. Homologous characteristic, feathers. You could say probably in here there was probably an evolution of fur, because we have mammals. Nothing down here has fur, just mammals do. But this gives you an idea of ancestry. It looks very much like a family tree that you would have seen when we did pedigrees, or if you look at like Ancestry.com or whatever and you see a family tree. This is basically the evolutionary family tree. That's all we got for Chapter 15. Make sure you take the Chapter 15 quiz. See you in class.